Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Black Visual Culture at the Institute of African American Affairs. My name is Khalila Abdurazak. I am the program manager here at the center. And on behalf of our director, Dr. Deborah Willis, and our program director, Dr. Joan Morgan, I would just like to welcome you all tonight. We are so thrilled to have you and see your faces. We know it's pouring outside, but we're so glad that you made it here with us tonight for this event. Now the program director, Dr. Joan Morgan, will introduce our distinguished guests.
Thank you, Khalila. Can you guys hear me? Hello, everyone. Thank you for braving the rain and the 300 things that can come up in New York City while you're on your way to an event. We're really happy to have you here. I am Dr. Joan Morgan. I am the program director here at the Center for Black Visual Culture at the Institute of African American Affairs here at NYU. We are so delighted to welcome Dr. Tanisha Ford and Dr. Marlon Bailey to NYU and to the CBVC for Renaissance People, Black Femme, Joy from Harlem's Mollie to Beyonce, a discussion of Dr. Ford's book, Our Secret Society, Mollie Moon, and the Glamour, Money and Power Behind the Civil Rights Movement. Their discussion tonight will be followed by a Q&A and a book signing. I am thrilled to put these two people in conversation, not only for their brilliance and their insight and their proclivities towards nuance, but they are also just dear friends and inspirations of my own work. So Marlon and Tanisha, it's wonderful to have you. So I'm gonna tell the folks a little bit about you. Dr. Tanisha Ford, in addition to being, I believe, Mollie Moon's handpicked muse from the other side, is a professor of history, biography, and memoir at the Graduate Center, CUNY. Tanisha has written 4 books: Dressed in Dreams, A Black Girl's Love Letter to the Power of Fashion, Kwame Brathwaite's Black is Beautiful, the award-winning Liberated Threads, Black Women's Style and the Global Politics of Soul, and now Our Secret Society, Mollie Moon and the Glamour, Money, and the Power Behind the Civil Rights Movement. Tanisha engages with national and international audiences about the cost of racial justice movements, the history of Black mutual aid networks, philanthropy and the civil rights movement, and the Black Midwest and the geopolitics of the fashion and beauty industries. I would like to add, although this is not part of her official bio, part of what makes Tanisha's work so compelling is the excitement and the enthusiasm and the deep love. She is deeply in love with us as a people, and I think that that is the thread that binds all of her work. Joining Dr. Ford in conversation is Dr. Marlon Bailey. Marlon M. Bailey is a professor and associate chair of African and African American Studies and professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. He is a Black queer theorist and critical performance ethnographer who studies Black LGBTQ cultural formations, sexual health, and HIV/AIDS prevention. Now, without further ado, I'd like you to join me in welcoming our distinguished guests, Dr. Tanisha Ford and Dr. Marlon M. Bailey.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you all for coming out. This is great.
It really is. And Dr. Morgan is right. I mean, in New York, if the weather's bad, if you stubbed your big toe on the subway on the way, you're going back home. Like, you're not coming out. So I thank you for being here. It means so much.
Yeah, so I want to thank the center. I want to say thank Dr. Morgan, Khalila, for inviting me. And I want to thank Dr. Ford for this incredible book. This is, I mean, I was just telling her it's a page turner. I couldn't stop turning the pages, and especially with all the tea that she exposes. So I just wanted to start our conversation by talking a little bit about the kind of connections between our work, the story of Mollie Moon and my work on the ballroom community, I brought it here. I only have one copy though. So, but there are a lot of connections that I want to just highlight that will frame our discussion. The first is that both works focus on the richness and transgressive nature of the underground, right? A lot of the sociopolitical organizing that gets highlighted when it comes to Black folk is what's on the surface, the sort of conventional popular notion of what the civil rights movement actually meant and did. But through the book, we see all kinds of things that were going on that were really essential and foundational to movement making. And similar, the ballroom community has, even though it's, it's popular these days, but throughout the time that I was doing my ethnography, it was basically an underground community formation, and it shares some overlap between the 1920s, 1930s, and definitely 1960s. The contemporary ballroom scene, as we know it today, started in the 1960s, but a lot of the elements of ballroom, like drag balls, costume balls, queer family formations, and transgressive gender and sexualities, that started way back 1920s, 1930s. So there's a lot of connections and overlap. Second thing is there's always back tea to every movement, and the back tea that is revealed in Dr. Ford's work is really essential, is the fundraising and the money, the cost of movement making that was very autonomous within the community. There's a part of some of the questions that I want to ask that I titled "The Revolution Will Not Be State Funded." Because it was funded from within, and there's all kinds of other kind of back teas that we'll get into. The third thing is that the cultural labor performed, the richness and the importance of the cultural labor performed by those on the margins of society. There's overlap between Mollie Moon and her crew and her community of people and the ballroom community, the way that these communities transform gender and sexuality and norms and transform how we think about politics and internationalize Black political movements and Black political philosophies. So I found these things to be overlapping as well. So having said that, I'll ask you the first question about the book. So you are a Black feminist cultural historian. I'm a Black queer ethnographer. I'm interested in what made you interested in Mollie Moon? What got you interested in this particular story as it relates to the civil rights movement and other Black political movements?
Yes, first of all, I want to say thank you for being here with me tonight. And I really have to credit Dr. Morgan for this, because we were talking about ways that we could, discuss the book. And I was like, at this point now I'm getting asked all the same questions all the time. I want to have a different point of entry into the work. And so we started thinking about ways that I could set up this conversation. And she brought up your name, and it made all the sense in the world, because of the queer elements of this work that are to me they're not tangential to the work, they're foundational to the work and to my perspective, my methodology, how I approached the archive with this project, but also because you were really one of my introductions to gender and sexuality studies. I was a graduate student at IU, you were hired on the faculty at IU, and when you were hired, I was like, what? Black people do gender studies? Right? I had taken all of my Black feminist theory courses through Black studies, So you have always been one of those voices for me that have shaped my work, and I've just followed your career and also see you as family, so thank you for being here. To answer your question, I started working on this book actually when I was at IU, when we were at IU, right? I went to the Schomburg Center to do some research on my dissertation. That became my first book, Liberated Threads, and stumbled upon the name Mollie Moon, not knowing anything about her. And it was actually an article about a beauty pageant that she had held in Harlem in the early 1960s. And I love that she was celebrating Black women's beauty and just the gorgeous pageantry of it all. And I wasn't looking for her because I didn't know anything about her. I was looking for a model who actually happened to be a contestant in one of her Beaux-Arts balls. And so that led me down this path to collect everything I could about Mollie Moon. I love the name Mollie Moon, you know, and this is like before Issa Rae's Insecure, so I didn't really know any Black Mollies, right? And so I was like, Mollie Moon, ooh, you know, and so I started collecting all these newspaper clippings. Before I knew it, I had amassed hundreds of clippings, and I thought, this woman was clearly very popular in her day. Why had I never heard of her? And then once I began to realize that these parties that she was hosting, these you know, galas and beauty pageants, they weren't just parties for party's sake, which would have been totally fine. You know, I was intrigued even by that. They were also fundraisers for the movement. And then that led me down this whole path to try to understand, well, how was the civil rights movement funded, by whom, and why don't we talk about the money? So following that messy money trail has allowed me to unearth so many seemingly lost histories of the civil rights era, taking a long Black freedom studies approach. So beginning in the, you know, the New Negro movement era and moving through the 1960s.
So, you know, that's interesting. I want to talk about the parties, right? It's because the way we think about raising money for a movement, we don't necessarily think about it as a form of activism. And we don't necessarily think about activism as a party, right? So there's this connection between the party, the ball event, the costume ball, and not only for the purpose of raising money, but also for transforming the culture, right? So ballroom has a similar kind of political economy, if you will, right? And the traditions out of which ballroom evolved was out of a tradition of balls, costume balls, but also out of a tradition of rent parties, speakeasies, buffet flats. So these traditions were not only opportunities for Black LGBT communities or Black queer communities to get together and convene and to explore their genders and sexualities because they were excluded from these other spaces. They were excluded from white spaces. They were excluded from straight spaces. So these underground spaces became opportunities for them to explore themselves. They were also spaces of care. Care meaning if you needed to get your rent paid, you needed to pay your rent. And this kind of everyday collective care, I see it, and this is what I was thinking about as I was reading your work. I see it as a part of movement making, right? You got to have a place to live. You got to, you know, there are many situations where young Black LGBT members were kicked out of their home because of their sexuality, and people would take them in. People would take them in. They would hold parties to pay for rent, to pay their bills. So this whole fundraising economic piece, or the cost of movement making, it's really this sort of underground practice that is so essential to many of these marginalized communities that have made such enormous contributions to how we see ourselves. And so the next question that I have for you is that after writing this book, how would you say that we need to look at activism and the relationship between culture and activism? Or we need to kind of look at it differently. We need to look at the civil rights movement very differently.
You know, Well, first, I just want to say to the audience that we have these amazing images on the slide honoring the traditions of visual culture that the center is invested in, thinking through questions of portraiture and the representation of Blackness in the visual realm. And a lot of these images come from Molly Moon's signature fundraiser ball, and also the Hamilton Lodge balls, which I think her balls were inspired by in large part. So as you listen to what we're saying, I also want you to do a visual analysis of some of these images, and then hopefully this can also help fuel our discussion. But I think from the jump, my engagement as a historian of the civil rights era has always been about thinking, how can we find new ways to study this movement? Like the top-down approach, or the big events and the big male leaders. When I was going to grad school, we were learning that was a limited way to view the movement. And at the time, studying the cultural elements of the civil rights movement meant studying the music. So at first I thought I was going to write this dissertation about, soul music and protest. But once I started to look at how Black women and non-binary femmes were incorporating their dress and their hairstyling choices into their politics across the African diaspora, then my work kind of spun out from there, saying, okay, we need to really rethink the ways in which we study Black political formations, Black kinship networks, Black cultural expression, and the role of the cultural in the movement. So one of the things that drew me to Mollie Moon was realizing that, oh, well, she's the hostess with the mostest, right? She's hosting all of these parties, and then she's married to one of the leaders of one of the big 6 civil rights organizations, Henry Lee Moon, who's publicity director of the NAACP, and they're hosting a lot of these events in their home. So I was really taken with how she was decorating her home and finding in her letters ways that she's talking about spending or even overspending to decorate this house, because she knows that this house has to be pristine in a certain kind of way because they're going to invite people in, that displaced people from across the diaspora who, for their political beliefs or their sexuality, have been displaced from their home nations. They were taking them in to their house. They were hosting fundraisers, informal fundraisers, but they were also just having a good time. Mollie Moon was known for her rent parties, and in fact, even once she became a more mainstream, at least within the Black community, fundraiser, she would host these rent party inspired events. Say if like all the black men in publishing are coming to New York City for a conference, well, I'm gonna host a rent party and I'm gonna make sure all the baddies in New York City are at the party. We're gonna have food and drink, like that was her way. But a lot of this, I started to realize, comes out of the Black queer artistic community that she found once she fled New Orleans and the conservative respectability politics of the Creole elite in New Orleans. She moves to New York City in 1930 and befriends people like Langston Hughes, Dorothy West, Countee Cullen, Claude McKay. I mean, the list just goes on in terms of the people that she forms these friendships with. And this is a moment where you have even if in the ways that we think about Black queerness today, these people weren't expressing it in their art in the same kinds of way, all of those motifs were there, the imagery was there, and these folks were exploring their sexuality, not in these neat, bifurcated categories of I'm queer, I'm straight, I'm gay, I'm a lesbian. It was a lot of sexual fluidity, and home spaces became spaces where people could form these relationships, both across genders, but also across races. And so Mollie Moon, a lot of her early fundraisers are inspired by this energy, and more specifically by the Hamilton Lodge drag balls, which really reach a certain kind of prominence in the years immediately after World War II, so in the late 1860s, excuse me. And by the 1920s and 30s, these events have 8,000 attendees who are coming, and these weren't just queer or just straight people. It's everybody across a cross-section of Black New York and also white New York as well. And they would attend these balls. Like I said, here's a picture right here from some of the balls. And in the early 1930s, there was so much police repression that the balls were shuttered. Like the doors of the Hamilton Lodge for these balls were shuttered. But one important piece I noted from that is that the organization that put them on was a benevolent society. It was a mostly Black benevolent society. So this is a mutual aid organization, and the balls just become one of their big annual events. So once that event ends in 1937, Mollie Moon's first ball is launched in 1940. So it's a way to create a certain kind of cultural continuity into her space. Like we no longer have this space, but I've created a different space for us. So we're gonna fundraise. At this time, she's fundraising for the Harlem Community Arts Center. We're gonna fundraise, but we're gonna do so in this way that's free, that, we're not invested in the kind of respectability politics that I think we tend to put upon Black folks in the 1930s and 40s. So it was fun for me to go back to see this history and to see look what the people were doing, right? Look how they're showing up, I loved it.
Yeah, and there's this, not only in New York, so I talk about this in my book, that there's this long tradition of costume balls and drag balls that extended in other cities throughout the country with large Black populations. So my work focuses on Detroit, and there was this period around the 1960s where there was this tradition where these huge balls put on by this religious figure, and it was extremely popular, and it was attended by folks across the gender spectrum, across the sexuality spectrum, and across the racial spectrum. And it just demonstrates the way that somehow, and this is why your work is so important, somehow we've kind of disconnected this performance, this sort of underground performance, tradition, gender and sexual transgression of norms, traditions, and actually the way that these communities educate the world. They tell us what gender and sexuality actually are, right? That we've kind of disconnected these traditions from movement making. And they are very central, they're very core parts of movement making. And part of that is because of the way that we have often connected, sort of bifurcated and created these binaries around gender and sexuality. Because we were talking earlier about and what you just commented on is that during this period, these sort of gender and sexual categories that we live with today, they were not in formation at that time. They were still formulating. They were not codified. People didn't run around saying that they were this or that. People just lived their lives, and they loved, and they had, they engaged in sexual expression or sexual interactions with people because they liked the person, not necessarily because of what that person's gender identification was or not. And there is a way that we have gone into these sort of fixed categories that actually separate communities and separate people, separate us. And it also kind of prevents our organizing, our mobilization. But speaking to that, we also talked about, and what you highlight in your work, is the political diversity, the Black political diversity, and diversity among Black political philosophies that existed within the Civil Rights Movement and before in the 1930s. And Mollie, so there were socialists, Black communists, Black liberals. And I'd love for you to talk more about how Mollie kind of occupied this interstitial, Mollie and Henry occupied this interstitial space. They were neither fully communist or socialists, but they were neither fully liberals, right? They occupied this other space that I think is important when we think about the history and the complexity and diversity of Black political thought. But another important thing is that they were able to be engaged with people who did not share their political thought and still were able to break bread, as you said, break bread with each other.
Yes, yes. So one of the photographs in our slideshow here is from a trip that Mollie Moon made to Moscow in 1932. She was part of this crew of folks. If you're familiar with Langston Hughes's memoir, I Wonder as I Wander, he writes about this trip. But they were there because, at the behest of the Communist Party USA, to work with this Russo-German film company that wanted to produce a racial propaganda film that addressed the horrors of Jim Crow, segregation, and labor exploitation across the U.S. South. Now, Louise Thompson, later Louise Thompson Patterson, had difficulty recruiting actual stars of stage and screen to be in this film because a lot of people didn't want to be associated with the nascent USSR. So she ended up recruiting within her own friendship circle. So Mollie Moon goes, her best friend Dorothy West goes, Henry Moon is there, his best friend Ted Poston, other like people whose names we might know, like Lauren Miller, who was a major figure in the NAACP's desegregation cases, who worked very closely with Thurgood Marshall. So a lot of these people were there. Pauli Murray wanted to go, was supposed to go, but Pauli was a senior in college at the time and was concerned about graduation and also having the money to go. So it's like a diverse group of folks who go to Moscow. Very few of them have official ties to the Communist Party, but a lot of them considered themselves New Negroes. They did have a politic that might have been considered radical in its own way, shape, or form, but a lot of them were just young people in their early to mid-20s who just wanted to travel, who wanted to see the world, and this gave them an opportunity to go abroad. With a lot of these people, the political formation, where some of them did gravitate more towards communism and socialism, it came through experiencing a certain kind of social and cultural freedom in Moscow in ways that they could not in the United States. So I just loved finding letters, and I have a couple letters in the slides here, or a postcard even, where they're writing home talking about, we're just being treated like royalty here. You know, we're going to the opera. We're eating at the finest restaurants. We're welcomed into jazz clubs.
Holding same-sex
Yes.
couples are holding hands.
People were, exactly, they were, having,
Right.
you have women, even women from like really Black religious families who were moving there and then experiencing love, with other women for the first time, or experiencing love with, not only someone of your same gender, but of an opposite race, right? And so this was a time where people were, so that's why I say, for me, a queer studies approach was essential to understanding how this becomes foundational to the politic. You cannot separate the kind of gender and sexual awareness and revelation that these people are having from the new Negro politics of the day. Right? So for me, this group of people, that kind of queerness is at the core of the intellectual thought. So when they come back, so Mollie moves from Moscow to Berlin, and she works in a lesbian cabaret. Now, she doesn't realize at the time that it is, right? She's thinking, I'm going to get this job, and I'm going to find me a rich sugar daddy, who's going to pay my bills. And then she realizes, oh, well, damn, okay, this is a lesbian club. But so many of her friends, are what today we would call lesbians, or today we might call bisexual. So it's not like this is like, oh, now I got to get out of this job. She continues to work there. She writes in her letters about how they're going to these all genders, all sexualities clubs in Berlin. And this is like in between the wars. So just as, the Nazi Party is coming into power in Berlin, this is when Mollie and her peers are living here, exploring their sexuality and so forth. She leaves there with a very, in her mind, defined political point of view, and I then see her as a Marxist social theorist. She comes back writing about the proletariat, writing about labor exploitation in the Midwest, thinking about her stepfather who's working in the mills of Gary, Indiana, for example. So socialism really becomes at the core of her politics, even though Henry, he leaves Moscow and is like, I was not a communist before, and I'm not now, right? I am anti-capitalist, right? I am pro-union. I am invested in the anti-colonial movement. I am, pro-Pan-Africanism, but I am not a communist, right? So you have these two people who are forming a romantic relationship, but are on opposite sides, or what seems like opposite sides of the political spectrum. But what I started to realize is that, and I know a lot of us can relate to this. You might have friends or family members where, I love you, fam, I don't agree with you on this. Now, we still gonna break this bread, right? We might smoke this weed, we might, have this wine, but I don't agree with you on that issue, right? So one of the ways that, my a queer studies approach allowed me to get at these complexities, or as Dr. Morgan says, to fuck with the grays, was it allowed me to see that things don't break down so neatly in the ways that we as historians often try to paint them, to make it manageable for us to grapple with in terms of the source material we might have or the paradigms that we're invested in. But this project for me really disrupted a lot of the paradigms that I had espoused about this movement and its political formation. So the group that goes off to Moscow, in many ways for me, are the secret society. And these are people who form friendships that I trace over the course of the long civil rights movement, to see how these friendships evolve, how they splinter at different moments, how they reconcile. In fact, this also speaks to the free love of it all. Mollie Moon and Dorothy West were best friends. At the time, Dorothy was dating Henry Moon. They break up. Mollie gets with him, right? But Dot don't care, right? You're right. So, but Dot doesn't care because Dot's dating Mill Jones, who is a visual artist who's a recent graduate from Hampton University, right? So there's a way in which, today we'd be like, oh girl, what? You doing what with my man, right? But back then it's like, oh girl, yeah, we did our thing and now we're done doing that thing, right? Now I'm off doing this thing with this woman and we're living together and so I loved that. I loved getting at that, and I loved getting at the politics of all of this, and how somebody like Pauli Murray and Mollie Moon both work very closely with the National Urban League. They have different experiences within the league, but it's Pauli who helps keep Lester Granger and later Whitney Young honest around their sexuality shit, right? Around their gender shit, right? Pauli's the one who's like, nah, this is a problem, And so I love that in ways that Mollie perhaps feels like she can't speak, Pauli is speaking and standing in that gap and addressing these issues and holding the men to task.
I love the queer methodology approach because it also points to the way. Oh, sorry. I love the queer methodology approach because it also points to the way that we are always in process. We are always in process with our sexuality. We're always in process with our gender. We're always in process with our politics. And when we look back and the way that these periods and these communities, the way we look back at them not accounting for the process of transformation. So Pauli Murray's relationship with Mollie helped, I'm sure, both of them evolve politically, evolved in terms of gender and sexuality, particularly Pauli Murray's impact on Mollie. And so I think that the queer approach, which at the center of queerness is about process. It's about, nothing is fixed. Everything is always in formation. So having said that, then I want to get your sense of today, right? What our politics, the integral relationship between gender and sexuality, and our in many ways, our political philosophies, Black folk, right? What's happening? What does Mollie have to tell us? What is Mollie telling us through you about what is happening today? For example, the difference between the civil rights movement, which at the forefront is very cis hetero, Martin Luther King, Adam Clayton Powell, the cis hetero folk at the center, even though we knew a lot was going on behind the scenes. People like Molly Moon was raising money. People like Barrett Rustin was actually doing all the planning. And the women and the queers were doing all kinds of stuff behind the scene. Now we have Black Lives Matter, where the Black queer folks are at the forefront, at least in terms of how it's represented. Well, what do you think? What would Molly Moon say about this relationship between then and now?
So one of Mollie's greatest contributions to the movement is that she establishes the National Urban League Guild, which becomes its own movement, and in many ways, and she's very, very clearly articulates that this guild is formed out of this radical group of Black folk, largely Black women, who are organizing around the Harlem Community Arts Center. So a lot of these people have a very far left-leaning politics. So she's very clear that this organization comes from that tradition. And in many ways, people see it as more radical than the National Urban League itself, okay? So by the time we get to what we consider the more traditional civil rights movement period, there are guild chapters in major cities across the country. And so we have to also remember that there was a second wave of a great migration of African Americans. So there are a lot of cities that are on the map in ways that they weren't before. So, even places like where I'm from, Fort Wayne, Indiana had a guild, Indianapolis had a guild, Grand Rapids, Michigan, Providence, Rhode Island, Phoenix, Arizona, Houston, Texas, Louisville, Memphis, Miami. Like, a lot of these places had guild chapters, and even when the local National Urban League affiliate had been run out of these southern cities, they could establish a guild and keep the work going and keep the fundraising flowing, right, through the things that the events that the guild were hosting. So it's important to understand that legacy, but to also hold that piece of information in tension with the fact that most of us don't know Mollie Moon's name today. So I started thinking about why that is. This person who's contributed so much, who was a major Black fundraiser, who was a strategist, right, in a time when Black people didn't have access to social services, and even in the ways that we do today, which are still abysmal, but we especially did not in the age of Jim Crow. She was a social worker who was using her skill set to raise concerns around Black migrant conditions from across the global South who are moving to these major cities in the United States. So why don't we know her? And I think part of it is because many people, when they saw her in that day, she didn't fit the bill. Even though by all intents and purposes, she was a heterosexual Black woman in a heteronormative Black relationship to the public. She was a mother, she was a wife, she had a day job, she was college educated, all the respectable pieces. These images that you see up here that are running in Jed and Ebony and across the Black press linked her to a certain kind of lasciviousness, a certain kind of queerness, a danger, something that was explicit. And, it didn't align with the kind of image that people were creating around images like this, right? Case in point. It didn't align with the image that they were creating, especially of Black women who had to uphold the race in a certain kind of way that even their male counterparts who were sleeping with everybody, right, didn't have to uphold. So I think that at least one thing that I would hope that she would think is that by taking this kind of approach, this is how we find Mollie Moon, right? I can find Mollie Moon because if I try to find her through a more traditional heteronormative lens, I don't see her. I see Rosa Parks, right, which is important, right? We need to see Rosa Parks, right? But we see a figure like a Mollie Moon when we take a Black queer studies approach approach, right? Like it allows us to even enter into the archive asking a different set of questions around that archive, right? And so for me, that has been part of the work, and it has been the best parts of the work. And I do think that, when I was telling my editor about this book, when I was trying to, sell the book at the time, he was like, whoa, like this is a blueprint for activists today. And I think that what I also heard him saying in that is that it gives us a new way of seeing our folk, right? It gives us a new way of discovering Black queer folk in the archive, because, most of the people who were involved in the Urban League guilds were women. There were men involved too. And I think the heteronormative way to read the men's involvement was to say, oh, these were the husbands of the women who were involved. And sure, some of them were, but a lot of them weren't. They were men who were drawn to this kind of social-based work that a lot of people effeminized, right? So regardless of what their own sexual orientation might have been, the labor they were performing was considered effeminized work, right? And so in that way, they too were invisible in the archive. But once you take this kind of approach, then you see, oh, one of Mollie Moon's secretaries who was writing letters to the Duke and Duchess of Windsor asking them to be guest judges at one of the Beaux-Arts ball, competitions or costume competitions, that's a man who's doing this work, right? That's not just somebody, your husband is not just saying, oh yeah, girl, let me write all these letters, right? Like, let me do that secretarial work, So it allows us to come up with all these other names. A lot of Mollie's escorts, especially when she and Henry are living apart, who are, escorting her around town to these events, are a lot of single Black men. Now, whether they were queer or not, I mean, people like Hugh Jackman, is Hugh Jackman the actor? I always get Harold Jackman. I just get right. Like some people speculated that that he was in fact queer. County Cullen. People have speculated around his sexuality. So a lot of the people who are squiring her around in the absence of her husband are people who, at least in some way, shape, or form, people might have thought were queer. Right. So doing this part of the work was something that I touched upon in Liberated Threads, but became more deliberate in terms of my methodology with this book.
Because it's also helps me think about my work on the ballroom community, where there are all kinds of different labor roles, different what I call care labor, forms of care labor that men who are house fathers, gay men, or we call butch queens in the community, who are house mothers. So they take on a mothering role, but they're men, right? And often the different kinds of genders take up different kinds of forms of labors of care that we would not associate in a heteronormative society. And in order to see that, we have to look at it through a queer lens. And also the kind of underground caring for those who have been dispossessed kind of labor, kind of work that ballroom has always done is also something that we need a sort of a queer lens to look and see the value of that. And finally, with the HIV/AIDS epidemic, that the ballroom community has been ingenious about using performance and culture to educate its community members, nurture and provide social support to its community members that is destigmatized, right? That affirms their sexuality, affirms their gender expression, and does not, associate it with disease, right? So it delinks the whole stigma of disease from their very being, right? And that's really important labor. So that gets me to another question that I think is really central to your approach and this story that you tell about Mollie Moon, which is also a story that you tell about Black movement making, is the role of love. And we talked about the different kind, the kind of enduring love, the kind of different kind of way to think about love and the role that love plays in movement making, Black movement making. Can you talk about the power couple and their lifelong friendship, even while they weren't necessarily, while they weren't always together, but they found a way to continue to love each other, and that love was also central to the movement work that they were both doing.
So in one of my earliest presentations on this work, I mean, the book was really in its infancy. It was more idea than book. I did a talk at Radcliffe, and if anybody who knows, the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard, a pretty conservative place. And the talk was, tea and shade, a methodology, right? So, from the very inception, I'm thinking through, how to grapple with these questions. And the question around love, for me, I think at the core of this book, it is a love story, and it's a love story about not just romantic love, but community love, the love of self, the love of friends, of family. In fact, I love at the end of the book, I'm able to write, and this is not me reading into the sources are actually saying this, it's Black women who forced the National Urban League to recognize Mollie Moon and her decades of volunteer service and fundraising. They reclaim her. They're like, you will not put her in the corner any longer, and we will make sure that you don't, right? So, but as I mentioned before, she and Henry formed this relationship. They're friends at first, and he's several years older than her. She had a thing for older men, I've realized. A lot of her husbands, she was married 3 times. So, Henry's her 3rd husband. A lot of her husbands were older than her. And they formed this friendship. He seems to be someone that she can confide in and show her real self to, even though she's kind of putting on certain kinds of social airs. She can be herself around him. And I saw in their letters, they wrote letters to one another in ways that you and I might text one another. They wrote each other incessantly, which was great for me as a historian because I had so much source material. And you could really see a true friendship forming. And so I wrote their relationship in this way, even once there was all this controversy around the nature of their relationship. Do they have an open marriage? People were thinking of them as the Will and Jada of, the civil rights era. There's, the entanglements, right? And they were accusing her of having an affair with Winthrop Rockefeller, who was, someone she worked very closely with, in the Urban League. And there were rumors about Henry and his sexuality. But their relationship endured through all of that. And it was beautiful to find in David Levering Lewis's interviews that he had done for his book When Harlem Was in Vogue, an interview he did with Henry Lee Moon, and you can hear Mollie in the interview, and at one point they even invite her to sit down with them and talk, and so she's, in it she says something about Zora Neale Hurston, and, she's going back over these friendships she had with people. But you could even hear the friendship, and these interviews were recorded in the late 1970s. You could hear that even in their advanced age, having been together since 1938, they were still really close. And everyone I interviewed who knew them as a couple said the same thing. And they were yin and yang. She was the one who was more outspoken, very charismatic. This is somebody who could have been a politician, for real, in her day, had misogynoir not been what it was at that time. He was the introverted one. He was the bookish guy who was super smart, but he wasn't gregarious in the kind of ways that Mollie Moon was. So you could see how the two of them, how they complemented each other perfectly. So I use the language power couple to describe the work that they're embarking upon. They don't use that language in the archive, but I was trying to use a language that contemporary readers could understand. But it's very clear through their letters that they have a shared political vision and that they see their home as a space in which they can enact that vision, that they can mobilize and, union activists are coming through their home, entertainers, they're getting people book deals. Like imagine going to your friend's party and then the top editor that you've always wanted to publish your book with is there, and then you're able to broker the book deal, like they're doing all of this work through their home. And I love that. And so that when I think about this love practice, it makes me curious to hear from you. Like we're talking about the contemporary moment. And part of this talk is thinking about like the Renaissance. So we started talking about, Black queerness in the, the new Negro Renaissance era. But of course now this language of Renaissance has resurged, both in terms of a reflection on the past and with the things that the Met is doing around, their new exhibition about the transnational reaches of the Harlem Renaissance, but also with Beyonce and her Renaissance album. And so what is your take on the current state of ballroom culture and the love and joy practices? How are they existing in the age of social media and so forth?
Yeah, it's a complicated story.
Break it down for us.
I know, I know that many ballroom members have a kind of fraught relationship with Beyonce. Although her gesture is for many is well taken in terms of the music and the album and her commemoration of her uncle. But ballroom has suffered from a lot of extraction and a lack of kind of celebration of their ingenuity and their and what they have offered to society within the community. I think it continues to thrive. It continues to teach us what family actually is and what community actually is. It continues to teach us about what love is, even though sometimes they love a little hard and it's a little intense. But it also teaches us about what the body can do, what the performing body can do and how the performing body can create certain knowledges about the world and how it can also affirm difference and how it can affirm diversity, gender and sexual diversity and variety, and affirm their lives. Taking all of that into account, we still are in a time where what the outside world sees of ballroom, they don't see what is happening inside. And on the one hand, they don't see the challenges, right? That we're consistently facing dispossession, and we are continue to be disproportionately impacted by the HIV/AIDS epidemic and by poverty and being unhoused, lack of food, poor health outcomes. So all of the kind of celebration doesn't really highlight the structural problems that ballroom members are constantly facing. It also doesn't highlight the many things that the ballroom community does and its members do in the everyday to continue to affirm each other, right? So we see the ball, we see the big performances, we see voguing. All of that is important and great, and it's all what ballroom has created. But there's day-to-day loving and caring for each other that doesn't get recognized, and that is also what is sustaining, and that is also what ballroom has to teach to the world. It has to teach to the world about diversity and embracing everybody. Even though, if you're competing, you will get chopped if you don't rise to the occasion, but that doesn't mean that you get chopped as a person. You get chopped. Your performance gets chopped, but you don't get chopped as a person. So I think it's a mixed bag, but I ultimately think that ballroom has a lot, it continues to have a lot to teach the world, similar to Mollie. No. I think we gotta go to the audience.
Fundraising, how was that money accounted for? And how did they make sure that no one stole the money or and distribution?
Yeah, I mean, it is a really good question, and let me tell you, it's messy. It is very messy. Um, and let me think about where I want to enter that question without giving a whole lecture just on that alone, because I can, but I won't. So it really was a complicated business with this fundraising piece. So one thing that I try to highlight in the book is another division we often make is between working class Black folks and middle class Black folks. And in most of these narratives, the middle class Black people are the enemies of the working class, and they have all these ideas about racial uplift that they're imposing on the Black working class. And so part of what I try to do in the book even is to disrupt a lot of those notions too, particularly in the time period that my book covers, because you might have a college degree, but you are living in the same hood, as your neighbor who does not, right? And at a time when most African Americans were living at or below the poverty line, these kind of divisions that we've kind of imposed in terms of class didn't exist in the way that we have written them back on it. Another way I try to get at that is by showing the role that white philanthropy played in this fundraising piece. So looking at how these white elites, to use language of political scientist Megan Ming Francis, how there's this act of movement capture. Like if we give money to this movement, then we can kind of steer where the movement goes, who's in leadership, what kind of agendas that they are pushing, right? So part of the impetus then was to mobilize Black people of all socioeconomic classes in order to raise money within the community to keep the money within the community, meeting the needs of the folks within the community. So that was very much Mollie Moon's agenda when she first started fundraising, particularly for the Harlem Community Arts Center, which was founded by Augusta Savage in the late 1930s, and received some New Deal funding, but a lot of it, they wanted it to be the money to be raised by members of the community. They wanted it to be their community center. So she comes from that kind of fundraising tradition, but once she starts working with the Urban League, and it makes this move toward really recruiting the money from the white elite in New York City, she's compromised in certain ways. So in the book, I try to address the various debates within the community around fundraising and how those things are connected to this broader political spectrum or political thought that we were discussing earlier. A lot of these organizations were accused of stealing or mismanaging money. Mollie Moon herself was accused of this, at least at one point of time. And what I learned from activists then and now is that lobbing these accusations of theft became a way to divide the movement. A lot of this tended to be, and I'm talking in this case specifically to the organizations I studied, tended to be infrastructural problems. So if you get an influx of money, but you don't have an infrastructure to take in said money and then to redistribute it, then that can look like theft or misappropriation of funds, even if perhaps that's not exactly what's going on. So this became a way to delegitimize Black organizations and Black people to say, you have this movement, but you don't even know how to manage all this money, right? So should you then have it, right? The flip side of that I also have been thinking about is, well, what does it mean to be a well-funded movement? And does being a well-funded organization, does that in and of itself suggest some kind of compromise or some kind of capitulation to capitalist structures of wealth accumulation, right? So I've been trying, in the book, I try to explore both sides of this in ways that I think will help illuminate some of the issues that we see playing out in the media today around this person has stolen this money, this organization received X amount of millions of dollars, look at how they fumbled the bag, There's nothing new as it relates to this issue around money and fundraising, but I do want us to think about the benefits and the limitations of a 501c3 status, the benefits and limitations of a fund. Like, what does it mean to take on this label of a fund? This comes very much out of a white capitalist, financial infrastructure. So Again, I won't get too wonky on this, financial nerd wonk, but these are all the things I had to learn in order to be able to write this book.
Trying to narrow it, because there's so much that's exciting me. Following up on that, that really makes us have to reflect on the choices of some of the groups, like SCLC. We always sort of think, well, they had to take this choice because they were relying on that white northern money. And so maybe that wasn't the whole story, And so some of those conservative choices maybe were based on some conservative feelings, I mean, I'm just interested in that. I guess I also wondered, it sounded like you were kind of talking about this, the Garveyites, Nation of Islam, sort of their models too. Is any of that overlapping for you?
Yeah, most certainly. One of my favorite moments in Mollie's archive is finding this letter where she's writing to Henry. I love their conversations about politics. Like they really got into the thick of the politics in their letters. And so she's talking about going to this event at the library in Harlem. And which is now what, the County Cullen Library, is that what they call that thing? So she's at an event. There's this major forum on race relations in the early 1940s, and Claude McKay, who is one of Molly Moon's really good friends, is on the panel and is speaking. And a lot of Black nationalists are there, Garveyites, and they're talking about a Black nationalist approach to the freedom, to Black freedom. And she's writing to Henry listen, I'm so tired of so many of these people talking about interracialism. It's not going to work. I found myself agreeing with the Garveyites, right? So it was really important for me to show, even within Molly Moon, her own political spectrum, right? That there were parts of Black nationalism that she did espouse. Or to think about somebody like a Charlotta Bass, who of course, the FBI and Congress dogged for decades because, you have to be a communist, But Charlotta was also president of the NAACP chapter and the NUL chapter, not the NUL, the UNIA chapter, right? So you can see, again, within this one woman, this spectrum of Black political thought. So it's definitely that. To your earlier point about the politics around the money and the SCLC and these other organizations, they were choosing between a set of terrible choices. There's no other way to look at it, at least if you ask me, right? There's no other way to look at it. There was no way, if you have a movement that is increasing in terms of its need, right? What people need, the intensity of anti-Black violence, especially on the other side of the Brown v. Board decision, where white citizens councils are booting these Black organizations out of the local community chest so they can no longer get any local funding. Well, you need money from somewhere. Where is it going to come from? These organizations are bankrupted now. The NUL was literally in the red, right? Because of this anti-Black violence. The money has to come from somewhere. Black communities are trying to raise the money. And we have traditions of giving. It doesn't matter if you're Black American, if you're from the Caribbean, if you're from West Africa. We all have these traditions of giving that are central to how we see ourselves and our connections to communities, right? So, but it wasn't enough money. So people are cozying up to JFK, they're cozying up to the Rockefellers, they're cozying up to the Taconic Foundation to try to get this money. And the result is this grant system where people are applying, just like you and I apply for a Ford Fellowship. They're applying to the Taconic Foundation to get money to fund a voter registration drive, to, rebuild their building after it's been firebombed, and so while I consider myself a student of Malcolm X, and Malcolm X was very critical of the Big Six leaders who formed under this Council of Unified Civil Rights Leadership in order to secure funds for things like the major voter registration drives and the March on Washington, he's very critical of them, and I understand that criticism. I think there's much critique there, but when I'm actually looking at the financial records, doing a deep dive, I'm like, ooh, there was really no money. right? Like the money was going out just as fast as they were getting it. So it's really, I mean, what happens when you live in a nation that's built on the back of enslaved labor, where capitalism is the law of the land, and all of these financial systems are built upon it. Even the so-called good hand of white philanthropy that's helping to fund this movement. Hi.
Excited about your book. I can't wait to dive in. I did have a question. You did say she was a mother. And so I was wondering how much of that role impacted just how she was viewed. Because, you know, women are so often just defined by either being a mother or not being a mother. And then the second question that I had, which is just about the costumes that were put together for the balls. I was looking at some of the dollar amounts that they spent on these costumes, and I'm wondering, like, was there one particular group that made the costumes? Were they self-made? I mean, they're two very different questions, but.
But I
Thanks.
appreciate both of them.
Thank you.
So Mollie Moon became a mother later on in life, especially for that time period. And what was interesting, like I remember talking to my editor, who's also like an expert in this area, and like, wow, you know, there's just, you know, how people talked about motherhood or didn't in that time period. And a lot of people, there's a way that now with our current understandings of motherhood, when we read back on the past, we kind of read contemporary understandings of motherhood onto the past. And really being a mother was in certain ways part of Mollie Moon's public identity, but in many ways it wasn't. There were mentions of her motherhood, but very strategically. So she was a mother, but that wasn't central to how the broader public saw her. And by the 1950s, I mean, she was the grande dame of New York City, who was written about regularly in Ebony and Jet. She was virtually a model for Ebony. So more than a mother, though, it was the fact that she had her domestic impulse, or her skill was through her cooking. And she was this hostess. She hosted all these great events out in the public. She had this very discerning taste, but she could also cook really well. And so people wanted to be invited into her home to eat her famous shrimp creole. They wanted to, you know, so it was more about, I am a great party planner because I understand something about the domestic sphere, and that's mostly around how to be a good host, how to cook, you know, how to invite people into my home, which was another thing I loved about the David Levering Lewis interview, where when they come to her home, she asked them, you know, can I get you some water, something stronger, right? And so she ends up making them a cocktail, which seems like it's the middle of the day, right? But they're in here drinking cocktails. So I think it was more so that element of her public persona that shone through in the archive. In terms of the costumes, people put a lot of money and effort into these because they were winning big prizes. So even in the early 1940s, I found that some of the prizes for the Beaux-Arts Ball costume competition were a cruise to the Bahamas, you know? So it's like, okay, I'll shell out some money, you know, if I can get a cruise to the Bahamas, you know what I mean? So, and there was just a lot of pride in this. And so I talked about the Hamilton Lodge influence, but she was also deeply influenced by Carnival celebrations across the Caribbean. And so that element and the pride, the craftspersonship that goes into creating, having an idea and executing it was definitely a part of the celebration. And then also what I noted about Mollie Moon, especially in these early balls, she always dressed up as a queen. Whether it be Marie Antoinette or Queen Elizabeth or, you know, whoever it was always a queen. She was the queen of the ball. And I found a newspaper clipping or a magazine story in her personal papers that she had cut out and saved of this black magazine who said, what can you all make out of this big parachute? We have this military grade parachute, what can you make? And so she had her seamstress whip up all these different costumes where each of the women who were leaders in the guild in New York City made a costume out of these parachutes. So just that kind of creativity and involving black dressmakers and costume makers into the mix was interesting to see too.
I want to add to that because that tradition continues within the current ballroom community. So the ballroom community has its own sort of political economy, and so they put on balls and they raise money by putting on balls by charging people, right? So you go and you pay $30 entry fee. It might be something more now, but when I was doing my ethnography, but they have to pay for everything. So with that money that they pay for the DJ, because contemporary balls, they have to have certain things. They have to have a DJ, because you got to have music. You got to have a commentator. You have to have what they call the master or mistress of ceremony, which is the DJ, the commentator. And they have cash prizes, right? So, and they have to secure the hall. They have to pay for security. So they have to do a lot of things because, black queer folk don't have their own spaces, right? Well, many black folk don't have their own spaces, but black queer folks definitely don't. So, and then what happens is that when the hosting house of the ball, they send out a list of categories. So balls, there are a variety of categories. So it's, and some of the images show body realness, which is, or femme queen realness, or runway. So a lot of the categories don't necessarily require extravagant dress, but some categories do, like bazaar. I have some images in my book of bazaar categories where you create these costumes, and it's based on a theme. So the hosting house, they will send out a theme, and then everything, all of the categories, the competitive categories have to go within this theme, and then you represent the best in that theme. But many of the members who walk those categories, they make their own clothes, right? So they make their own clothes, or they buy it, or they steal, right? So there's that tradition as well. So it's a part of the political economy. But and then whatever money, and they win prizes, sometimes $2,000, $5,000, $1,000 prize, right? And they have different categories of prizes. And then that's how the house, whatever is left over, the house uses that money to put on the next ball. Or if a person wins a cash prize, they use the money for themselves, and sometimes as a house, because there are categories as a house, and the house can win the cash prize, then they use that money to put on the next ball. So it's a kind of internal thing that they draw from various sources. But I wanted to emphasize that many of the competitors, particularly if they compete in these categories that's about what they're wearing, they make them. They make their own clothes.
And I just wanted to say one thing about that too. So we talked about like the roots of Mollie's ball, and we can see some of these early images from the balls. But once this became something of a corporate vehicle for the National Urban League, a major fundraiser, it moves downtown, to Midtown, to the Waldorf Astoria. Some people see this as a victory. We're breaking the color line. Other people, particularly I found black women writers in the Pittsburgh Courier who were like, no, because now it's lost all of the costumes, the things that made it uniquely that community element, that sense of, friendly competition within the community, the time spent, creating your costume, all that has now disappeared. And they're like, now everybody's coming in their furs and their ball gowns and tuxedos. And in the book, there's a picture of Muhammad Ali at one of the balls from the late 1960s in his tuxedo. And, it's like, it's lost something. And I think Molly Moon tried to preserve it as long as possible. She kept it in Harlem long after people wanted her to move it to Midtown. Once the Savoy closes, it moves to the Bronx for a year, and then it finally moves to the Waldorf. But yeah, like that it was helpful for me to see the sense of loss around it, around those traditions. It's never come back, even though that the National Urban League's ball is like a big thing in cities across the country. That costumed element has never come back.
I was curious about her background in New Orleans and like how that, plays into who she becomes. Like, could you tell us a little bit about her early days? And then also just this piece you've mentioned about her being influenced by Carnival and Caribbean. Did she travel there? How does this come into her?
Yes, yes, yes. First, I just want to say hi to my fam from my Black Women in Media and the Arts group. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you both. Listen, it takes all kinds of community, right? When I first met some of the folks in the group, I was working on the book, and now it's out in the world. So thank you for celebrating with me. So she was born in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, in 1907, and spent her formative years in Cleveland, Ohio, which meant a lot to me because that's where my mother is from, and that's where my parents live. And then she goes back to Mississippi to attend high school at Rusk College, and at the same school that Ida B. Wells attended. And then she goes to get a degree in pharmacy from Meharry, and she marries one of her college professors. They have the secret romance, right? And then, surprise, we's married now, right? So then he's from New Orleans, from, a moneyed Black family in New Orleans. So they move back there and start their pharmacy business. There's scandal. You can read about it in the book. She flees New Orleans and that marriage, goes to Gary, where her mother has remarried and has settled with Mollie's stepfather. And then saves up enough money, it seems, working in a local pharmacy in Gary, and moves to New York City in 1930. Because of the trip to Moscow and things that she's experienced personally, she decides that she wants to do something that's that's social justice oriented. So she's either going to be a high school biology teacher or she's going to become a social worker, and she ends up going into social work. So that's a little bit on her backstory, but there was a second part of what you asked about. Oh, yes. So she traveled extensively. So it seems to me that the trip to Moscow and later to Berlin, living abroad there for over a year, was perhaps her first trip abroad, but from then on, she traveled very extensively across the Caribbean. She had some of her good friends, they relocated to the Virgin Islands, and so she would go there regularly. In fact, Professor Farrah Jasmine Griffin, her husband, when he saw the cover of the book, he was like, I knew her, I met her in Cuba, right? So, she was moving all around. She traveled Ethiopia, all across the continent, all across Europe. So travel was a part of her thing, and she did this in ways that predated this wave of Black international travel. And, in the World War II era and afterwards, she was already kind of doing these international travels.
Can we please give our speakers a round of applause?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was great.
This is so great. Thank you.
This was so good.